All right, thanks for coming, guys. Guess we'll get started. We met our critical mass. Three's a company, rather than just one, two. Yeah, sit closer. That'd be great. All right, so as I mentioned, the purpose of this extra class session is to give us the opportunity of discussing Adorno's For an Informal Music, which is one of the few essays that he's published that has any kind of like more positive, programmatic kind of suggestion about what people should do. So he was asked by friends and students, younger people who had been inspired by his writing, what they should do as musicians. There's another essay that he wrote called Transparencies on Film, similarly posed to him by his kind of colleagues, friends, students, people inspired by his work in the New Wave, in the film New Wave, the German New Wave, but also beyond the French New Wave, the Italian New Wave. So he knew a few people. So there's the Darmstadt Music Festival, kind of avant-garde music festival, and then there was the Oberhausen Film Festival. So in this case, it's the Darmstadt Music Festival that is the kind of setting or kind of environment, milieu, in which Adorno knew these people who shared their work post-World War II. So we're solidly in the period of late modernism, and we might even say postmodernism. So I wanted to make some mention of that. If we keep in mind our kind of periodization. So we have modernism, growing out of Romanticism in the mid-19th century. And then we have the period of high modernism, the period before World War I. Then we have a crisis of modernism that takes the form of a disintegration into the 20th century avant-garde, late modernism, mass culture, or kitsch, and the political art of the 20th century. So we have communist art, socialist art, nationalist art, fascist art, liberal democratic art. It's an art that's much more politically oriented. And of course, what we're talking about now is the period after World War II. We looked at those 20s. We looked at the article by Adorno, those 20s, I think earlier in the course. We looked, if we didn't, we could look at it today and just see if we discussed that before. I think that we did, but maybe not. Maybe we did not. Okay. In which case, so he's writing this for an informal music in the 1960s. And postmodernism, the question of postmodernism, is raised in this period after World War I. So postmodernism is usually dated from the 1960s. So it's a kind of a term used in art in the 1960s. Prior to that, it was used in architecture after World War II. So it's coined as a term to refer to phenomena in architecture after World War II. And then in the area of fine art and literature, it's something that is introduced in the 60s and 1970s. So Adorno died in 1969.
So you'll skip me. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right. So what we're dealing with now is this period after World War II. And so I raised these other dates in here because this is the sort of interwar years and the lead up to World War II that are obviously consequential. The 1920s, so if we haven't looked at this already, we'll look at this today. We'll look at a few passages from his essay, Those 20s, which he wrote in the 60s about nostalgia for the 1920s in Germany. And the nostalgia for the 1920s in Germany had to do with the pre-fascist era. So it's the kind of a nostalgia for the Weimar Republic after World War I and before the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, which was facilitated by the Great Depression, which began in 1928. So I put, in terms of World War II, 1936 as our start date. Because even though World War II is conventionally dated as starting in 1939 or 1940 with the invasion of Poland, it really begins in 1936 with the Japanese expansion of their invasion of China, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia and Libya, and the Spanish Civil War, in which the French and the British and the Americans were neutral, but the Italian and German fascists intervened on the side of Franco in the Spanish Civil War. So if you know the painting Guernica by Picasso, a famous painting that's in the UN Security Council, or it was. I'm not sure. I think that it still is. Yeah, it still is, right? There's a famous anecdote about this that Adorno will mention. Of I don't know if we haven't talked about this in class, have we? The Picasso, the Guernica painting. So when the Nazis invaded France, and established they occupied part of France, and then they established the Vichy Republic, allied with the Nazis. Picasso still lived in Paris. He remained in Paris under Nazi occupation. The Nazis came to his studio, and they said, "Did you do this painting?" And he said, "No, you did." Right, so this depicts the Spanish Civil War. This is the bombing of the Republicans, the defenders of the Spanish Republic, by the fascists. This would be late modernism, late Picasso. So if you guys know your art history, Picasso before World War I, Picasso after World War I. Kind of a step down a little bit. I mean, Picasso remains a great artist, but his work before World War I is a little bit more radical than after World War I. Okay, so let's look up, try to find. we might have discussed this, but maybe we haven't. So let's look at just the beginning of, and the end of this piece by Adorno, those 20s, because it helps us out a little bit. If you recall, when we were reading aesthetic theory, the beginning of aesthetic theory, he talks about how there's a sort of radical freedom available to artists and writers circa 1910, but that's what was remarkable was how little the artists took advantage of that freedom and instead tried to reestablish order on themselves. So he also talks about this in a similar vein here. So this is a published piece as opposed to aesthetic theory, which remained unpublished at the time of his death. Slogans make themselves suspect not just because they serve to degrade thoughts into mere game-playing chips. They are also the index of their own untruth. What the public, and particularly the revivalist vogue, nowadays thinks belonged to the 1920s was in fact already fading at that time by 1924 at the latest. The heroic age of the new art was actually around 1910. Synthetic cubism, early German expressionism, the free atonalism of Schoenberg and his school. Adolf Friese has noted this fact in a recent radio interview with Lotte Lenya. Do you guys know who Lotte Lenya is? The famous singer from this era, and she became a kind of a Hollywood actress personality also in the period when they fled to the United States, when the Nazis came to power. They all kind of fled to the US and to Hollywood. Schoenberg, Lotte Lenya, Adorno too. Adorno and his colleague Max Horkheimer also lived in Los Angeles and Santa Monica. And Lotte Lenya hated Adorno. She absolutely hated Adorno, so she refused to attend any parties that he was invited to. Anyway, and I think that I might have mentioned to you guys Hans Eisler, who is a collaborator with Bertolt Brecht on Brecht's musicals. He is a German communist. He goes back to East Germany after World War II and writes the East German national anthem. He wrote a book with Adorno when they were in Hollywood called Composing for the Films, where that's another positive kind of piece by Adorno. But it's not just about music, it's also about just sound in general as an element of cinematic art. I can clearly remember that after an IGNM festival in Frankfurt in 1927, I published an article entitled The Stabilized Music. So this is when he was quite young. This would have been when he was 24 years old, because he was born in 1903. It was not, as is usually assumed, the pressure exerted by the National Socialist terror that brought regression, neutralization, and a funereal silence to the arts. For these phenomena had already taken shape in the Weimar Republic and in liberal continental European society generally. The dictatorships did not swoop down upon the society from outside in the way Cortés invaded Mexico. Rather, they were engendered by the social dynamic following the First World War, and they cast their shadows before them. I will also say, I think that we might have discussed this before, but maybe not. So Adorno was a student of the so-called Second Viennese School. So he was a student, not directly of Schoenberg, but of Alban Berg. So the Second Viennese School are Anton Webern, Alban Berg, and Arnold Schoenberg. And Schoenberg is the leader of the group, and Schoenberg also didn't like Adorno, and said that Adorno didn't.
In a personality way, or like because of his
He didn't like his personality. He didn't like his writing, also because Adorno wrote. Right before World War II broke out, Adorno wrote a book called The Philosophy of New Music, or Modern Music, and he did a kind of comparison of Schoenberg versus Stravinsky, and Schoenberg thought that Adorno was unfair to Stravinsky.
Why?
Because Adorno was kind of, seemingly, to praise Schoenberg and condemn Stravinsky. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. Because, in fact, we'll see. We'll see.
What was Adorno like as a person? Like, personality? You know much
He
about
was like
personality?
a very intelligent, genius type person who maybe was socially not very graceful,
Okay.
and who would speak his opinion.
Okay.
So kind of lacking in social
That makes
graces.
sense.
Yeah. Horkheimer said, and I think Marcuse agreed, Herbert Marcuse agreed, that he was the one legitimate genius of their group, the Frankfurt School. Yeah. He was the youngest of the cohort too, of the first generation. So he was the sort of wunderkind kind of character. And he certainly was the most prolific in terms of writing. Okay, so the dictatorships, fascism didn't swoop down on society the way Cortez did to Mexico. Rather, there's a social dynamic coming out of World War I. And I'll just, just to specify, the revolutions that broke out after World War I. The Russian Revolution, 1917, the German Revolution, 1918. And into 1919, and also there was a Hungarian Revolution. So, all the big empires of Europe broke up during World War I. So Russia broke up, the Prussian Empire broke up, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire broke up, and the Ottoman Empire broke up. And in some ways, we're still dealing with the consequences of the breakup of the Ottoman and Russian empires. So Israel-Palestine is a product of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, and Ukraine is a product of the breakup of the Russian Empire. And of course, there were other problems in Eastern Europe. The Yugoslav War is seen as a long-term, like with the fall of communism in Yugoslavia, the breakout of civil war there could be seen as a long-term consequence of the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, a lot of consequential history coming out of this. Of the revolutions that broke out, and there was also an uprising in Italy at the end of World War I by the socialists, who became the Communist Party of Italy. And Mussolini, small note, Mussolini had been a Marxist. He was an Italian socialist. He was a Marxist who invented fascism as a new ideology to be more radical than Marxism, to be more revolutionary than Marxism. But of these, only the Russian Revolution prevailed, and it had strange consequences. So Adorno mentions 1924. So 1924 is when Stalin, after Lenin's death, announced socialism in one country. Meaning, that's when Stalin announced that they were no longer waiting for a revolution in Western Europe. And they were going to try to build socialism in the Soviet Union. Which they did okay in the 1920s, but then the Great Depression really killed that dream and forced them to do the forced collectivization of the peasantry and the forced industrialization of the economy in a 5-year plan as a result of the Great Depression, because they no longer had as much international trade or foreign capital investment. And then when that failed, Stalin had to blame somebody, so he did the purges. The Great Purge. To blame, find the people to blame for having sabotaged the 5-year plan. Of course, nobody sabotaged the 5-year plan. It was just a disaster. It's like the Great Leap Forward in China. Okay, so he says, this is immediately evident in the products of mass culture manipulated by a highly centralized economic power. One has only to listen to the record albums that are now being revived as the hits, songs, and chansons from the 20s to be astonished at how little has changed in this whole sphere. As with fashion, the packaging changes, but the thing itself, a conventional language composed of signals to suit the conditioned reflexes of consumers, essentially remain the same, as jazz, for instance, was a perennial fashion. So he brings up jazz. The reason he brings up jazz is that jazz is an American original kind of style of music that really gains a international praise, interest, fashion after World War I, especially in Germany in the Weimar era, in the 1920s, but really throughout Europe. And it's so American musicians, Black American musicians, went to Europe to pursue their careers. And for Adorno, jazz is the sort of paradigmatic kitsch music that sets the standard for all mass music in the 20th century and later. So he's, for instance, the Nazis banned jazz in 1934, and Adorno wrote an essay on this in which he said that they can ban the genre of music, but they can't really ban it because everyone listens to music as if it's jazz anyway. It's like built into the musical listening experience now. All right, so he understands jazz as a phenomenon, as an alternative, we'll see, to musical freedom. And yet seems to be a kind of musical freedom. The reason that jazz is popular is that it seems to represent musical freedom, but he thinks it's a kind of ersatz freedom or a kind of false freedom. And so part of what mass culture kitsch does is that it gives people the illusion of freedom rather than the actual thing. And so how freedom appears, the appeal of something like jazz to people out of a desire for freedom is very important, because we looked at the Horkheimer, the little man in the philosophy of freedom, right? So capitalism is free, supposedly free, yes. So the question is, how do we experience our freedom in capitalism? What kind of subjectivity is involved in capitalism, such that we can still experience it as free, even if in a self-contradictory way. So one way of thinking about capitalism is that it's a self-contradictory form of freedom. So it's neither simply unfreedom, nor is it simply freedom. It's rather a self-contradictory form of freedom. The difficulty with this kind of approach is that actually everything is a self-contradictory form of freedom. So Stalinism was also a self-contradictory form of freedom, and indeed fascism itself was. Meaning that people embrace these things out of a desire for freedom, however in a self-contradictory way. And again, that's in the political realm, but it's also in the cultural and artistic realm. Meaning modernism as a form of artistic freedom is paradoxical. Self-contradictory. And in some ways that self-contradictory freedom of art in the capitalist era only gets exacerbated in later developments. And so this whole question of a high modernism, a late modernism, a postmodernism is bound up with this question of how do we experience freedom in the realm of art and literature, including music. He says, well, it seems that such past fashions have a naive and awkward aspect in comparison with the current trend, that they are doing what the slang of American light music calls corny. This is due less to the substance of what is disseminated than to the time factor in abstracto. At most, to the progressive perfecting of the machinery and of social psychological control. The quality of being not yet so smart, which provokes smiles from the same type of people who in those days acclaimed Mistinguett and Marlena, is of the same nature as the idealizing nostalgia that clings to those same products today. The period's comparative backwardness in the techniques of consumer culture is misinterpreted as though to mean it was closer to the origins, whereas in truth, it was just as much organized to grab customers as it is in 1960. In fact, it is a paradox that anything at all changes within the sphere of culture rationalized to suit industrial ideals. The principle of ratio itself, or reason itself, to the extent that it calculates cultural effects economically, remains the eternal invariant. This is why it is somewhat shocking whenever anything from the sector of the culture industry becomes old-fashioned. The shock value of this paradox was already exploited by the surrealists in the 20s when they confronted the world of 1880. In England, at that time, a book like Our Fathers by Alan Bott caused a similar effect. Today, the shock effect is produced by the 20s, similar to the effect the world of images of the 1880s produced around 1920. But the repetition deadens the shock effect. Oops. The defamiliarization of the 20s is the ghost of the ghost. In the German-speaking world, the imago of the 20s is probably not so strongly marked by the intellectual movements in period. Expressionism and the new music at the same time probably found far less resonance than do the radical aesthetic tendencies of today. So Expressionism, by the way, I mentioned the Second Viennese School. Second Viennese School, Schoenberg, for example, thought of himself as an expressionist in music. And he also did painting. He also painted. Not only wrote music, but painted, and his paintings are a little bit Edvard Munch-esque. They're very psychological in character. And in fact, his music, the free atonality of the pre-World War I period of Schoenberg, part of it is driven by his desire, by Schoenberg's desire to express feelings, psychological states that otherwise were not possible to do with conventional musical language. It was rather an imagistic world of erotic fantasy and was nourished by theatrical works that at the time stood for the spirit of the age and that today still easily pass for the same, even though their composition does not have anything especially avant-garde about them. The Songspiele that Brecht and Weill composed together, the Three-Penny Opera and Mahagoni, and Ernst Krenek's Johnny are representative of the sphere. The subsequent discontent with civilization's progressive desexualizing of the world, which at the same time paradoxically keeps pace with the lifting of taboos, transfers onto the 20s romantic desires for sexual anarchy, the red light district, and the wide open city. There is something immeasurably mendacious in all of this. The enthusiasm for barroom jennies goes together with the persecution of prostitutes who catch it from society's crystal clear order when no more suitable targets are at hand. If life in the 20s had really been so nice, then it would have been enough to leave the floozies in peace and stop trying to clean up the streets. Instead, antiseptically erotic films are made about the naughty 20s, or better still, about the Toulouse-Lautrec of our grandparents' time. And yet even back then, those girls weren't doing it for free. The wretched commercialized sex industry of the Kurfürstendamm, as portrayed by George Gross and transfixed by the words of Karl Kraus, was no closer to utopia than is the sterilized atmosphere of today. Nevertheless, the idea of the 20s were a world where, as Brecht puts it in Mahagoni, everything may be permitted. That is, a utopia also has its truth. At that time, as again shortly after 1945, there seemed to be a real possibility of a politically liberated society. But it only seemed so. Already in the 20s, as a consequence of the events of 1919, that was the defeat of the German Revolution, the decision had fallen against the political potential that, had things gone otherwise, with great probability would have influenced developments in Russia and prevented Stalinism. It is hard to avoid the conclusion that this twofold aspect, on the one hand, a world that could have taken a turn for the better, and on the other, the extinguishing of that hope by the establishment of powers that later revealed themselves fully in fascism, also expressed itself in an ambivalence in art, which in fact is quite specific to the 20s, and has nothing to do with the vague and self-contradictory idea of the modern classics. Precisely those operatic works that earned fame and scandal then seem now in their ambiguous stance, towards anarchy, as though their main function was to furnish National Socialism with the slogans it later used to justify its cultural terrorism, as though that assiduously exaggerated disorder was already lusting for the order Hitler subsequently imposed across Europe. This is not something for the 20s to boast of. The catastrophe that followed the period was engendered by its own societal conflicts, even in what is customarily called the cultural sphere. The extent to which the nostalgia for the 20s in fact clings to something intellectual, and not merely to a fata morgana of a period supposed to be at once avant-garde and yet not yet enwrapped in the cellophane of modernity, is decided less by the level and quality of what was produced at the time than by the true or putative intellectual posture itself. Preconsciously one senses how much the revived culture is being absorbed by the ideology it had never ceased to be. Since one does not dare to acknowledge this, one projects an ideal image of a past condition in which spirit supposedly had not yet been forced to admit its incongruity with the forces of reality. In comparison to what has happened since then, spirit altogether, Geist altogether, takes on the aspect of triviality. All right, so what he's getting into is, again, the sense, the modern classics, that somehow there was a possibility in the past that went unrealized, and that shows itself most directly in the cultural or artistic sphere as opposed to the political sphere. The political sphere, it's more ambiguous because the revolution led to Stalinism. Right, so art is less culpable, and therefore one can try to return to an earlier moment of cultural or artistic radicalism. And that's what happens in the 60s. So in the 60s, there's definitely a nostalgia for the early 20th century, for the avant-garde. So Dada and Surrealism. For example, if you recall the first week of class, we read Susan Buck-Morse, and she said, images in the mind motivate the will, Walter Benjamin. And she said that Benjamin was trying to claim for politics the power of images asserted by surrealism, but then she also said, isn't this really the technique of the advertising industry? Meaning, didn't advertising incorporate surrealist techniques very effectively to manipulate people? So, postmodernism I mentioned in the grad survey class that I'm teaching right now. We're in the segment of the course on postmodernism. There's and I think in our kind of supplemental readings that I put on the syllabus for the first week's class, we have Habermas and Lyotard debating postmodernism. So Habermas, Modernity and the Complete Project, and then Jean-Francois Lyotard answering the question, what is postmodernism? So Lyotard said, in response to Habermas said, the problem with the periodic surrealist or Baudelarian revolts in the realm of culture is that they leave society, the economy, and politics alone. They're so restricted to the cultural sphere. It's kind of a false freedom. And he attributed postmodernism to that. He said that postmodernism was what he called the movement of the young conservatives in the 1970s, by which he meant Foucault and Derrida and others. They were the young conservatives. They weren't the old conservatives, nor were they the neoconservatives. They were the young conservatives because they had abandoned changing society and the political sphere and had restricted any kind of attempt at change to the cultural sphere. So Lyotard said, well, no, this is the Marxist repressive attitude, and instead said that there are two souls to modernism. There's a kind of nostalgic soul to modernism that remains a kind of outgrowth of romanticism and is always trying to restore a kind of lost kind of bourgeois art. And then there's the second soul of modernism, which postmodernism claims for itself, and that's the more radical free play of the signifier modernism, where the medium can take on a life of its own. And he compared that leotard to science, in which scientific truth might disturb human sensibilities, but is nonetheless true. And that art, like science, has to be free to explore possibilities, even if it's at the detriment of social and cultural conventions. So, again, the issue of what's the relationship between art, science, philosophy, morality, religion, the Nietzschean questions. Postmodernists tend to be Nietzschean rather than Hegelian in their opinion. All right. Says, art feels culpable because it could not prevent the horror, but its own tenderness and fragility in turn presupposes a reality that could have escaped barbarism. And I think that we talked about barbarism when we talked about barbarism much earlier in the course. In Schiller had the Enlightenment counterposition of the savage and the barbarian. So the savage is innocent of culture and civilization, and the barbarian is the victim of a decadent civilization. So the reason this language was used during the Enlightenment is that the Enlightenment philosophers, they thought that European civilization had become decadent, had become barbaric. And that's why they could celebrate the noble savage by contrast with the decadent, barbaric European civilization. And the revolutions that broke out were meant to restore human freedom against the barbarism of the decadent civilization. The American and French revolutions were meant to do that, inspired by the Enlightenment. But capitalism, from the Marxist perspective, capitalism is barbarism, meaning it's the barbarization or the decadence of bourgeois society. This is why modernism could be condemned in places like the Soviet Union, Communist China, as bourgeois decadence. Because, of course, it is. The question is, what does it mean, and how does it point beyond itself? The imago of the time immediately preceding the catastrophe, namely the catastrophe of the 20th century, is invested with everything spirit nowadays is felt to be denied. The absence of intellectual movements that can intervene today. Even the existentialism of the first years after the war was nothing more than a resuscitative renaissance, awakens even in the most naive people the sentiment of sterility. It contributes to the legend of the 20s as the time when the very domain of spirit tottered, while still maintaining its earlier relevance to people's lives. The fact that after 1918 Cubism lost its appeal is certainly a symptom that can be diagnosed only post-mortem. Conwell Weiler reports Picasso said to me, Picasso still tells me quite often today that everything that was done in the years from 1907 to 1917 could have only been done through teamwork, being isolated, being alone, must have upset him enormously, and it was then that there was this change. The isolation that destroyed the continuity of the painter's work and brought him, and then only him, to start revising was hardly the fate of a contingent biography. That isolation reflects the loss of the collective energies that have produced the great innovations in European art. Shift in the relationship between the individual spirit and society extended even into the secret-most impulses of those for whom any adaptation to the demands of society was inevitable. There was no lack here of what the naive faith in culture calls creative gifts. The very idea of intellectual production had been poisoned. Its self-confidence, the certainty that it is making history is undermined. This accords with the fact that precisely to the extent that it is assimilated, intellectual production no longer has any actual effect. Even its most extravagant expressions are no longer safe from being integrated into industrialized culture. Because the world spirit no longer coincides with spirit, so the world spirit is capitalism, spirit would be freedom, the latter's last days shine resplendently as though they had been the golden age that in fact they never were. What remains is more an echo of fascist authority than anything itself living, cultural respect for received values, even if they are merely touted as being important. Better would be a consciousness that realized its own diminished potential. Beckett has it. It would no longer be a culture of renewed deception, but instead, one that would express in its structure what denigrates spirit to the level of such deception. The only means by which culture can cure its curse of futility is by submitting that curse to interrogation. Jumping right to the end here. However, there is no more compelling evidence of the contemporary cultural aporia in the 60s than the fact that the critique of this ideological aspect of a sanitized, pure aesthetic progress itself immediately becomes ideology again. So this is, of course, what the postmodernists rebel against. Just say this about postmodernism also to give it some concrete reference. So we'll be talking about John Cage in the foreign informal music. So Cage is a contemporary of and also a colleague, friend of Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, who are considered the first postmodernist painters, again, post-World War II. In the entire Eastern Bloc, this is still the Cold War era, such a critique serves simply to make the conformity total by stifling the last unruly stirrings that have taken refuge in art. This surely means nothing less than the foundation of art itself has been shaken, that an unrefracted relation to the aesthetic realm is no longer possible. The concept of a cultural resurrection after Auschwitz is illusory and absurd, and every work created since then has to pay the bitter price for this. However, because the world has survived its own downfall, it nonetheless needs art to write its unconscious history. The authentic artists of the present are those in whose works the utmost horror still quivers. That's an important thought figure right there. The world has survived its own downfall. The world has survived its own downfall. So what was that downfall? From the Adorno's perspective, the World War I. And the reason for that is that this period of high modernism before World War I was also the period of Marxism as a mass political movement of the working class in the advanced capitalist countries. So there was a revolutionary movement for socialism of the working class before World War I in France and Germany, the United States even, Italy, that there hasn't been since then. There simply has not been. So that failure is a profound downfall. These effects are still being felt. Okay, so in the realm of music, there's another piece by Adorno from the 1930s, so going back a bit, we were just reading him from the 1960s. But I want to just look at the beginning and end of. I don't think that we looked at this before. We might have. Did we look at this? We might have. We might not have. Okay. He's going to invoke a little Nietzsche. But this will help us in terms of how he understands the question of freedom in art more generally, but in music in particular. This is the fetish character in music and the regression of listening. It's from 1938. So fetish character in music is commodity fetishism. So, which by which is meant, of course, not a psychological fetish or a sexual fetish, not a displaced object of desire, not a substitute gratification, but a fetish in an anthropological sense, the sense of religion. Right? So commodity fetishism, the social relations of labor valued as a commodity, is our religion. It's our self-evident cosmological truth. That we measure human life in terms of the value of time in social production. So time is money, time is labor, time is life. And that, precisely that cosmology is thrown into crisis with the Industrial Revolution because it introduces machine time, which then competes with human time. And there's obviously an unfair advantage that the machines have over the humans. The regression of listening, that's more the psychological language. So the kind of infantilism of the listening experience, kind of narcissistic, infantile psychology of really any kind of immersive experience in art, but listening to music in particular. Also, however, historical regression. So he introduced that in that piece, those 20s that we were just looking at. The idea of, as his friend and colleague Walter Benjamin put it, there was progress in technology but retrogression of society. That's what capitalism represents. It's progress in technology, retrogression of society. So there's psychological regression, there's also historical regression. So he starts, he's writing when he's relatively young man, a lot of fireworks here, trying to impress his readers. Complaints about the decline of musical taste begin only a little later than mankind's twofold discovery on the threshold of historical time. That music represents at once the immediate manifestation of impulse and the locus of its taming. So what does he mean by the threshold of historical time? It's a kind of an ambiguous expression because he'll refer to Plato, so he refer to classical antiquity, classical enlightenment, the enlightenment of antiquity, Plato, Aristotle. Well, we've talked about vis-a-vis Nietzsche. There's that kind of idea of historical time starting with civilization, the classical civilizations. But there's also another sense of the threshold of historical time, and the threshold of historical time here is capitalism itself, meaning it's the moment in which, as Friedrich Engels put it, Marx's colleague put it, the task of socialism is the task of overcoming prehistory and attaining true human history. So the idea is that capitalism is the last stage of prehistory. So what Hegel called history, progress in consciousness and freedom, hadn't really begun yet. It would begin once we overcome capitalism. Threshold of historical time. So complaints about the decline of musical taste happen back then, they happen again now. And why? Because of this contradictory phenomenon, which is that music seems to be the immediate manifestation of impulse and the locus of its taming. It stirs up the dance of the maenads and the sounds from Pan's bewitching flute, but it also rings out from the Orphic lyre, around which the visions of violence range themselves pacified. Whenever their peace seems to be disturbed by bacchantic agitation, so we got the maenads, we got the bacchantes, we got the wild women, there is talk of the decline of taste. But if the disciplining function of music has been handed down since Greek philosophy as a major good, then certainly the pressure to be permitted to obey musically, as elsewhere, is today more general than ever. The pressure to be permitted to obey. So we looked at on the mimetic faculty, the mimetic aspect of art. So the idea that art, especially art that seems to tap into the emotions so readily, like music does. Why people complain about decline of taste in music is that they're afraid that music is causing social chaos. Right? So there's always these kind of moral panics around new musical styles. that are corrupting the morality of the youth. They're causing them to go crazy sexually, rock and roll, etc. It's what they thought about jazz at the time, and then rock and roll again, and then there's always a wave of this. They banned raves for a while. They banned raves because it was making the kids go out of control. Right. So is music giving form to emotion, or is it itself eliciting emotion? Because if it's giving form to emotion, then it would be taming of emotion. Music tames the savage beast. You heard that expression? It's Beauty and the Beast, isn't it? It's Beauty and the Beast. Let's see. Sorry. I try to keep my kids' references really ready. Uh, 1697. All right, that's good. Music soothes the savage beast. Actually, I want to remind myself of something. Classic fairy tale, but then it was adapted. I thought there was like a musical aspect to it. Maybe not. Because the film is based on something else. It's based on the fairy tale, but it's also based on, I don't know if it's an opera. Anyway, music tames the savage beast. Okay. But if the disciplining function of music has been handed down since Greek philosophy is a major good, then certainly the pressure to be permitted to obey musically as elsewhere is today more general than ever. So what does he mean by Greek philosophy? He means Plato. So Plato's Republic, he banned all music because he said music would undermine people's psychology and make them too licentious, too passionate. But he kept one kind of music. He allowed one kind of music, and that was military music. Right, so the paradox is that all music was banned except military music. Just as the current musical consciousness of the masses can scarcely be called Dionysian, so its latest changes have nothing to do with taste. The concept, concept of taste is itself outmoded. So taste, where we started the course, Kant. Responsible art adjusts itself to criteria which approximate judgments, the harmonious and the inharmonious, the correct and the incorrect. But otherwise no more choices are made, the question is no longer put, and no one demands the subjective justification of the conventions. The very existence of the subject who could verify such taste has become as questionable as has, at the opposite pole, the right to a freedom of choice, which empirically in any case no one any longer exercises. If one seeks to find out who likes a commercial piece, one cannot avoid the suspicion that liking and disliking are inappropriate to the situation, even if the person questioned clothes his reactions in those words. The familiarity of the piece is a surrogate for the quality ascribed to it. To like it is almost the same thing as to recognize it. An approach in terms of value judgments has become a fiction for the person who finds himself hemmed in by the standardized musical goods. He can neither escape impotence nor decide between the offerings, where everything is so completely identical that preference in fact depends merely on biographical details or on the situation in which things are heard, meaning if you happen to have been exposed to something. The categories of autonomously oriented art have no applicability to the contemporary reception of music, not even for that of the serious music, domesticated under the barbarous name of classical, so as to enable one to turn away from it again in comfort. If it is objected that specifically light music and everything intended for consumption have in any case never been experienced in terms of those categories, that must certainly be conceded. Nevertheless, such music is also affected by the change in that the entertainment, the pleasure, the enjoyment it promises is given only to be simultaneously denied. In one of his essays, Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, has raised the question of who, in a place of amusement, is really being amused. With the same justice, it can be asked who music for entertainment still entertains. Rather, it seems to complement the reduction of people to silence, the dying out of speech as expression, the inability to communicate at all. It inhabits the pockets of silence that develop between people molded by anxiety, work, and undemanding docility. Everywhere it takes over unnoticed the deadly sad role that fell to it in the time and the specific situation of the silent films. It is perceived purely as background, because this is why everyone listens to music on the bus and the train. So you know what Freud said about music is that it is an alleviation of anxiety. If nobody can any longer speak, then certainly nobody can any longer listen. An American specialist in radio advertising who indeed prefers to make use of the musical medium has expressed skepticism as to the value of this advertising because people have learned to deny their attention to what they are hearing even while listening to it. Okay. So I'm looking at the very end where the question of freedom comes back. Where it's in the face of regressive listening, music as a whole begins to take on a comic aspect. One need only listen to the uninhibited sonority of a choral rehearsal from outside. This experience was caught with great force in the film by the Marx Brothers, who demolished an opera set as if to clothe an allegory the insight of the philosophy of history on the decay of the operatic form, or in the most estimable piece of refined entertainment, break up a grand piano in order to take possession of its strings and their frame as the true harp of the future on which to play a prelude. Music has become comic in the present phase, primarily because something so completely useless is carried on with all the visible signs of the strain of serious work. By being alien to solid people, music reveals their alienation from one another, and the consciousness of alienation vents itself in laughter. Music, or similarly in lyric poetry, discussed in previous classes sessions, the society which judged them comic becomes comic. But involved in this laughter is the decay of the sacral spirit of reconciliation. All music today can sound very easily as Parsifal did to Nietzsche's ear. So we read about Nietzsche on Parsifal. It recalls incomprehensible rites and surviving masks from an earlier time and is provocative nonsense. So, to shorten the phrase, all music today is provocative nonsense. The radio, which both wears out music and overexposes it, makes a major contribution to this. Perhaps a better hour may at some time strike even for the clever fellows, one in which they may demand, instead of prepared material ready to be switched on, the improvisatory displacement of things as the sort of radical beginning that can only thrive under the protection of the unshaken real world. Even discipline can take over the expression of free solidarity if freedom becomes its content. It's a really important idea. Even discipline can take over the expression of free solidarity if freedom becomes its content. As little as regressive listening is a symptom of progress in consciousness of freedom, and that yielding expression, it could suddenly turn around if art, in unity with society, should ever leave the road of the always identical. Not popular music, but artistic music has furnished a model for this possibility. It is not for nothing that Mahler is the scandal of all bourgeois musical aesthetics. They call him uncreative because he suspends their concept of creation itself. Everything with which he occupies himself is already there. He accepts it in its vulgarized form. His themes are expropriated ones. Nevertheless, nothing sounds as it was wont to. All things are diverted as if by a magnet. What is worn out yields pliantly to the improvising hand. He used parts when a second life as variants. Just as the chauffeur's knowledge of his old second-hand car can enable him to drive it punctually and unrecognized to its intended destination, so can the expression of a beat-up melody, straining under the pressure of clarinets and oboes in their upper register, arrive at places which the approved musical language could never safely reach. Such music really crystallizes the whole into which it has been incorporated. It has incorporated the vulgarized fragments into something new. Yet it takes its material from regressive listening. Indeed, one can almost think that in Mahler's music, this experience was seismographically recorded 40 years before it permeated society. But if Mahler stood athwart the concept of musical progress, neither can the new and radical music, whose most advanced practitioners give allegiance to him in a seemingly paradoxical way, any longer be subsumed exclusively under the concept of progress. It proposes to consciously resist the phenomenon of regressive listening. The terror which Schoenberg and Webern spread, today as in the past, comes not from their incomprehensibility, but from the fact that they are all too correctly understood. Their music gives form to that anxiety, that terror, that insight into the catastrophic situation which others merely evade by regressing. They are called individualists, and yet their work is nothing but a single dialogue with the powers which destroy individuality, powers whose formless shadows fall gigantically on their music. In music, too, collective powers are liquidating individuality past saving, but against them, only individuals are capable of consciously representing the aims of collectivity. We talked about this when we talked about the commodity form, that the antinomies of the commodity form, use value and exchange value, they're related to other dichotomies such as public and private, work and leisure, individual and collective. So individual and collective, which shouldn't be confused with individualism and collectivism. Right, so those reifications of individuality and collectivity, individualism and collectivism, don't exhaust the true potential of individuality and collectivity. Now, I think that in the music selections that I provided you guys,
I'm just gonna go and get a coffee. That's okay.
okay.
It'll be quick.
Shall we do a break?
Okay.
What time is it?
It's 10
Is
to
that
11.
actually our time? So maybe we are due a short break.
Well, I don't mind just going.
I did not include any more. I might have, but all right, let's take a short recess, 5 to 10 minutes. Is the question of musical progress. So Mahler, before World War I, Satie in the era of period right around the time of World War I. What would musical progress mean? So before this, I was playing The Hero's Life by Richard Strauss. So Richard Strauss is a late 1800s composer who was trying to rescue music from Wagner. So if you recall, Wagner was the big villain, musical modernism. So trying to sort of outflank Wagner, trying to rescue music as a constructed art form from the mystifications of Wagner. And Strauss is famous for the music for 2001: A Space Odyssey. You know the film 2001: A Space Odyssey? No, but let's see if we can find that intro. He's influenced by Nietzsche with his anti-Wagner.
I used to see red up.
They give us premium access to YouTube. Certainly you guys know this beginning of 2001 Space Odyssey. So this is Thus Spoke Zarathustra. That's the music for this opening sequence. So it's been kitschified, unfortunately, by way of this film. Consider is what makes music music. So part of what is going on in the high modernist era right before World War I, but especially picked up again after World War II, is this threshold of sound in music. In other words, at what point does sound become music? Or the illusion of music, right? So we've talked about autonomy, and the autonomy is a bourgeois value. And so this would be, again, the era of capitalism. So capitalism per se, function of the Industrial Revolution, which is the crisis of bourgeois society. So the contradiction crisis, self-contradiction crisis. So I thought I'd go with that sequence from 2001: A Space Odyssey because human autonomy, freedom. So art, the beautiful, Kant, it's when the object appears to have a life, like the subject. So the artwork or the object, the phenomenon seems to be autonomous in the way that we feel ourselves to be autonomous. So it's the illusion of life. That's what Kant described the beautiful as being characterized by. So part of the issue with capitalism is one of the forms of appearance that it has is not the autonomy of life, but the autonomy of technology. And so music is when sound seems to be self-propelling, when sound seems to sort of drive itself. When it isn't simply like the threshold of sound, where it goes from noise to music, is when it seems to have a kind of self-organized and intentional aspect. So a lot of modernist composers, but especially avant-garde artists in the 20th century, are playing with that threshold. At what point does something go from being noise to becoming music, where it appears to be self-organized? And so in the realm of music, like in the realm of painting, for example, there's a kind of exploration of the 0 degree threshold. So at what point, what's the minimum at point at which something becomes art, where it seems to kind of have a self-determining, self-organizing, self-legislating, autonomous character, that it seems to take on a life of its own, as opposed to being dependent or heteronymous, ruled by some other principle or force. Again, music as the expression of impulse or as the locus of its taming. right? So does music imitate life, or does life imitate music? The mimetic character. There's actually another piece by Adorno I wanted to also look at. This is from a series of short essays that he wrote called Commodity Music Analyzed. So let's just look at this for a second. This will help us also with the kitsch question. He writes, the belief, this is from the 1930s again, from before the fetish-character essay. The belief of the popular social psychologists that the film is a dream machine and the happy end of wish fulfillment misses the point. The shop girl does not directly identify herself with the glamour girl dressed up as a private secretary who marries the boss. But when faced with this good fortune and overwhelmed by its mere possibility, she ventures to admit to herself what the entire organization of life normally prevents her from admitting, that this good fortune will not be hers. What is taken for the wish fulfillment is the meager liberation which consists in the realization that you do not have to deny yourself the most minimal degree of happiness, namely the knowledge that happiness is not for you, although it might be. The shop girl's experience is like that of the old mother who sheds tears at someone else's wedding, blissfully conscious of the happiness she herself has missed. Even the most stupid people have long since ceased to be fooled by the belief that everyone will win the big prize. The positive element of kitsch lies in the fact that it sets free for a moment the glimmering realization that you have wasted your life. All this applies to music with even greater force. Most people listen emotionally. Everything is heard in terms of the categories of late romanticism and of the commodities derived from it, which are already tailored to emotional listening. Their listening is the more abstract, the more emotional it is. Music really only enables them to have a good cry. This is why they love the expression of longing more than happiness itself. The function, for instance, of the standardized Slav melancholy in the musical consumption of the masses is incomparably greater than that of the greatest moments of fulfillment in Mozart or the young Beethoven. The leverage of music, what they call its liberating aspect, is the opportunity to feel something, anything at all. But the content of the feeling is always that of privation. Music has come to resemble the mother who says, "Come and have a good cry, my child." In a sense, it is a kind of psychoanalysis for the masses, but one which makes them, if anything, even more dependent than before. This is no longer quite so easy, not even in music. The more closely you scrutinize jazz enthusiasts, the more you begin to suspect that it is not enough to have perceived that their behavior is a mere reflex. They are not the mindlessly fascinated people they are claimed to be, and which they see themselves as. A particular act of will is required to submit to an ordained pleasure. You decide to go wild with excitement, just as you decide to have a good time. The identification with the agency which ordains the pleasure functions like this. As ego, you yourself issue the command to enjoy yourself, and then produce the official instinctive reaction only as a rationalization. The model of this behavior is the child who declares, "Today I'm going to be naughty." Or the adolescent girl who writes in her diary that she will now get a crush on a particular teacher. The mimetic element in the behavior of all fans, their eagerness to imitate, probably originates in this kind of decision, which takes place quite close to the threshold of consciousness. It is the same with humor. The jitterbug is not able to believe in his own excitement because he has himself turned it on and evades the conflict with the aid of ambiguity. The mechanism of rage plays its part here. Anyone who has decided to become excited simply has to screw up his eyes and clench his teeth. Such reflections, like many of those with a direct bearing on society, would seriously raise the question of how far the psychoanalytical distinction between the conscious and unconscious is really appropriate anymore. It assumes that the individual possesses a monadological density and autonomy that have simply ceased to exist. In order to repress anything, we must start by having an ego. The present mass reactions, for which musical reactions stand as the model, are only separated from consciousness by a thin veil. The veil should be broken through, but this is the very thing that is almost impossible to achieve. In fact, subjectively, the truth is no longer so completely unconscious. The position is comparable to that of ideology, which objective praxis is beginning to replace with lies. This would require a modification of the thesis that spontaneity was being ousted by the blind acceptance of whatever is being forced on you. Even the belief that nowadays people behave like insects transforming themselves into mere centers of obedience is still just part of the facade. Such a notion is grist to the mill of all those who talk a lot of nonsense about the revival of myth. We should say rather that spontaneity is being eroded by the enormous efforts which are imposed on people by their very acquiescence in what is imposed, just because the veil which surrounds that imposition has become so thin. In order to be a jitterbug and to become enthusiastic about what is forced upon you, it is by no means enough to surrender yourself and toe the line passively. For people to be transformed into insects, they require as much energy as might well suffice to transform them into human beings. Right, so even the manipulation of mass culture, which is really the model for how we listen. Right, so we're kind of taught our aesthetic experience is really through popular culture now. Our aesthetic education is really through popular culture. Is not something that is the responsibility of the art itself, but rather how we use it, what we do with it, how it functions for us. Its use value as we implement it ourselves.
So I'm a little bit lost. Like maybe okay, so Adorno said basically not only jazz, like if the music make you realize about wasting your time, if that means like kitsch.
More than wasting your time, you've wasted your life.
But you will never gonna realize until you're done.
That you've wasted your life? Well, I think we pretty much know that already. We have to be on our deathbed to know that. Well, in the sense, waste means squandered potential. Right? So that there's a possibility, that we have a sense of there being a possibility that we ourselves have inevitably wasted. Right? So that's why the happiness of realizing that happiness is not for you, even though it might have been. And so the happiness of recognizing that there was a possibility for happiness that you were denied. We talked about this a few weeks ago with the theologico-political fragment by Benjamin. So that what ancient religions offered in their concept of redemption was the idea of a kind of compensation for the unhappiness of life. That's not really possible. We can't redeem unhappiness because shit happens, life sucks, and then you die. That's true. So what can be redeemed is the realization of freedom. So we can't make up for unhappiness, but we might be able to make up for unfreedom. That's the idea.
Just to go back to the text that we
Yeah.
just read, I'm kind of following but a bit confused. Like when he's talking about like the beginning, you're like okay to recognize that you haven't had the life that you want, because in the moment of listening to music you couldn't see the life that you could have had, and you're like unable to imagine or to like kind of get out of your system, and therefore you're not like fighting for the freedom that you should be, because you're like able to just kind of extinguish that fight when you listen to like pop music.
Indeed.
Okay.
Indeed. In other words, art doesn't inspire the pursuit of freedom, but substitutes for it. Right. So art, which should be a kind of a model for freedom, becomes a kind of compensation for the lack of freedom.
But is that a certain kind of art, kitsch art, or is it?
Well, kitsch especially, we might say, but also the thing with kitsch is that it's not a matter of difference in kind, but of degree. Because everything that's avant-garde becomes kitsch. This is the Clement Greenberg idea. Everything that was avant-garde becomes kitsch. I mean, look, that 2001, I mean, Stanley Kubrick, it's like, he's like an American New Wave filmmaker, I guess. It's like a little bit like an avant-garde film or something. But it's also like extremely, like, it's like instantly kitschified. Like, so he's taking Ligeti's music or Richard Strauss's music or Johann Strauss's music, and it's, you know, he's doing something with it for sure. And he's doing something with film for sure, but it just sort of, it's like instant kitschification. You know? So kitsch is art. It is art. And it does therefore have the same content that art has, which is an expression of spirit or Geist or freedom. The only issue is how it does so. And again, kitsch didn't exist before capitalism. It's a hard one because we tend to think of kitsch as just popular art or folk art. It's not. It's popular art and folk art in the era of capitalism. But that's the difference. At least that's the hypothetical difference, meaning, you know, you guys know that I'm here to advocate for Adorno. So we might reject this idea that capitalism is different from other times in history. We might just say, well, you know, the peasants have their folk art and we have our popular culture. They're pretty much the same.
So you mean capitalism and kitsch kind of like appeared together?
Yeah. In the 19th century. And it really took off in a particular way in the 20th century because it seems like there's more of a disparity between kitsch and fine art, you could say, in the 20th century than there was in the 19th century. I don't know if we talked about this. The fact that a lot of what we consider to be very rarefied art, that you only see in a museum, would have been part of the popular culture at the time. So the painting of the 1800s that the Art Institute Museum has a very strong collection on were these were seen by the masses. So they had national art exhibitions and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people went through the Louvre and looked at the paintings. And the paintings were documented and discussed in popular journalism in the newspaper. So in the newspaper they had reviews of paintings the way we now reviews of film. Of course, film didn't exist. So the difference between like a kind of the way art has become completely rarefied and sort of sequestered, and generally people don't have like exposure to contemporary art. That wasn't true in the 1800s. So capitalism had happened, but since then the division between the kitsch and the avant-garde has really widened a great deal. It's not entirely separated because we know that all the pop artists, like the your Kanye Wests and these people, they of course are completely educated and completely immersed in art history and music history. You know, all the popular musicians have listened to Schoenberg and Stravinsky and everybody else. So, at the same time, their listeners are largely unaware of avant-garde music. So the producers are very much aware, the consumers not so much.
And then also in that last essay it goes on, he starts talking about like the ego and how we don't, in the era of capitalism we live in, there's no such thing as the ego. There's like a mass.
There's an erosion of the bourgeois subject.
Yeah.
Right, so that's what it means to say that it's a self-contradiction and crisis of bourgeois society. Is that the bourgeois subject that Kant describes, or Hegel describes, or Schiller describes, it is no longer there quite the same way, or is there only in a self-contradictory way. So we still try to make art, obviously. We still have this Renaissance humanistic, creative individual, the freedom and autonomy of cultural production, of art, of the experience of art, that's all still operant. And yet, it also seems to be evacuated of its substance or content. We seem to just be going through the motions with it. That's the paradox. So again, when Adorno, encounters young people who are going to ask him, what should we do? We want to continue to make music, but you've told us that the subject of art and artistic freedom is no longer. And he's like, well, okay, don't take me too literally. Right, so obviously people are still, or at least they still were. Again, what always haunts me teaching at the Art Institute and in the 21st century is, okay, is anyone making art anymore? Or have we, 30 years after Susan Buck-Morss wrote what she wrote, have artists gone underground? Meaning, is it just esoteric? Meaning, under the rubric of cultural production, are artists content to just have very little kind of subterranean little in-jokes or something in their work, rather than it be as explicit as it was in the era of high modernism? Where that's fully in the public sphere. It's not being ignored. It's not being ignored at all. So one of the things that Adorno talked about with Webern and Schoenberg, spreading terror. So if you guys don't know this, and this is true of Stravinsky as well, there were riots at their performances, right? So, people who had paid, decent money to buy a ticket to see a performance of a premiere kind of musical event, they, dressed in tuxedos or evening gowns, they literally, spontaneously got up out of their seats and started beating the musicians. Yeah. Whereas now, we listen to the most avant-garde music and we're like, ho-hum, this is more or less interesting, whatever. No, it elicited a very strong response because, again, if music assuages anxiety, then what about the music that thematizes anxiety? Or it's kind of like, what you musicians are doing is violating music. That's why it elicited a very strong physical aggression response from people who probably before they attended would have imagined that the last thing that they were going to do is go up and beat up the performers on stage, right? But they couldn't help themselves because it seemed like the music was betraying them in some profound way. And it's not as if they didn't know exactly what they were in for. They were like, oh, this is new music. It's a little edgy. Still, it caused them to freak out. So, we've become totally inured to that. We don't experience things that way anymore. Music doesn't cause riots.
I feel like it kind of does, though.
Does it?
Well, if you think about Kanye West recently, I feel like that not physical riots, but people online he's now cancelled.
For political reasons, right?
Yeah, but because of his lyrics.
The lyrics, but the music itself hasn't disturbed anyone.
But
it's
what
more
is
the
music?
political
You
content.
can't just separate music from its lyrics, I don't think, because he wouldn't be Kanye West if he was just if it was just the sound without any lyrics.
That's true. That is true. I think that the challenge would be, it's easy to show why politics might incite people, because there seems to be stakes, right? There seems to be, other kinds of stakes, whereas art that isn't political causing, people to riot is kind of well, but what are the stakes of it, right?
I see how that's different.
Yeah, there's isn't there a consequence, obvious consequence to Schoenberg writing crazy music? Right, whereas if, Kanye West does something very inciting politically, and in a compelling way, probably people react strongly because it is aesthetically compelling.
Yeah.
Right.
But how does that relate to just thinking about how Plato said that all music was banned except military music? How does that relate? Because that is music without lyrics, but that incites behavior.
Well, it disciplines behavior, right? So it doesn't incite. You wanted to get rid of music that incited and replace it with music that controlled.
But I'm sure it like amps the army up before they have to fight. You know, listening to this like pretty like rigid and like
Absolutely.
loud booming sound.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. But it has a purpose, right? So it's not like music for its own sake. I guess that's the other thing that haunts us from the bourgeois era, is that starting with the Renaissance, artists become increasingly free to produce what they want to produce, meaning they're not under social instruction or control or discipline as to what they produce in the way that they were previously. Meaning, you know, the church strictly regulated religious art, including religious music. The aristocracy strictly controlled what was acceptable, unacceptable, what was demanded, what was called for, what was rejected in the realm of court culture. And popular folk art regulated itself, also through a kind of collective cultural force. Whereas, again, starting in the bourgeois era, artists are free to allow art to dictate its own terms rather than serve other purposes. Again, the question of autonomy. So fast forward to the 20th century, and especially after the catastrophe, as Adorno put it in those 20s piece. So after the catastrophe, namely war and revolution, genocide, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, everything, then artists are like, oh, what do we do now? So what should they do? And what should music do? What should music be? What should this art form be? So not only what should the artists do, but if they're going to practice a discipline that seems ancient and yet is seemingly very different. So the music that's being created in the mid-20th century would have been incomprehensible to people from prior times, including just in the earlier modernist era. So like John Cage would be incomprehensible to Wagner. Would make no sense. In the way that abstract painting of the 20th century wouldn't have made any sense, even to painters of less than 100 years earlier. Just would not have made sense to them. Why would you do this? And the idea being that what drove that kind of radicalism in art was the tradition itself, meaning it's not that people were trying to overthrow the genre, it's that they were trying to preserve it as a meaningful experience. They were trying to preserve the possibility of music expressing anything, and certainly embodying autonomy in the same way that abstraction in painting was meant to preserve painting as an essential art form. You know, like in other words, to give it some substance, to give it a purpose, right? In the era of mass culture, mass imagery, photography, why should anyone paint at all? Right, so that's what's driving it. In the same way that in the face of mass kitsch in music, why should anyone try to make classical music? Classical music? What is classical? Is it art music? Well, what do we call this music?
How does that relate to like representation after Auschwitz, which I think didn't Adorno say, like, I don't know, actually, it's like the classic Adorno quote.
To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric.
Yeah.
But then he celebrated Paul Celan, who I think we didn't look at his stuff. We're going to do that next time. We'll look at some Celan in our last selections from Aesthetic Theory. We'll go back to what we neglected from the Lyric Poetry and Society Week on Celan. So he celebrated Paul Celan, who was a Holocaust survivor, and who was kind of a late modernist or postmodernist writer, kind of like Beckett. So he invokes Beckett a great deal. Samuel Beckett. is our epigraph. To say it without knowing what. That's what that epigraph means. And it's from The Unnameable, which is a Beckett novel, I think. It's not a play, it's a novel. So to say it without knowing what. So to make music without knowing exactly what it is. Right, that's the informal music idea. And he, as an older person, when he's writing this in the 60s, he's like, oh, maybe my whole perspective belongs to the past. But nonetheless, let's try to see where it can get us. Right? Again, the idea that there might have been a historical regression from Adorno's youth to his mature age, that maybe, again, the question of musical progress, what would musical progress mean? So he's writing in the era of like Cage, who's doing stuff with kind of tapes and kind of technological alterations, recording technology. Also, this is when computer music starts. Computer music starts after World War II. The computers that were invented, why were they invented? To calculate bombing. Right, because mass warfare means that you need computers to tell you how much tonnage of explosive has to be delivered in what amount of time in order to do maximum damage. That's why we have computers. Right, and then you make the computers sing. After they tell you how to obliterate populations through bombing campaigns, then you let them do tricks. You make them make music. Yeah, we've been dealing with this like so-called AI problem for a long time. Maybe computers can make music that humans would not make, and maybe that's cool. Maybe we want the technology to create art for us instead of ourselves. So we're giving technology the autonomy that we used to see in nature as a reflection of ourselves. Right, that's why I subjected us to the 2001 Space Odyssey sequence, because it's kind of like, okay, what if the space station dances? What if it's a ballet of spaceships in orbit rather than of people on stage? And of course, cinema is a technological medium. Cinema renders motion in the way that a machine can render motion. So, and Adorno's not hostile to any of that at all. Right? He thinks that if anything, musicians have utilized technology too little, that they haven't taken full advantage of either the recording media or of things like computers, electronic music. So it is a question of the imagination, to go back to it, which is to say that what if technology allows for, but also cultural knowledge, education, allows for seemingly infinite possibilities, and yet we sort of stay within certain grooves and fail to realize that potential. So we can produce things that our imagination would not on its own generate. And that seems to defy a kind of humanistic definition of art. We can produce aesthetic forms that go way beyond our aesthetic imagination. Right, so one of the ways that he talks about this is, I think that we've already addressed this in the aesthetic theory, which is that the idea that capitalism is the contradiction contradiction of the bourgeois social relations. And the industrial forces of production. And I think the way Adorno describes it is that aesthetic form is a force of production. So aesthetic form is a force of production. Bourgeois social relations, the social relations of labor. So human labor in particular as a commodity. So human labor valued as a commodity versus the industrial forces of production. Right, so we have things, we can have a computer produce music that we ourselves could not. The human labor itself could not. And even before we have that kind of automated aesthetic production, artists are subjecting themselves to kind of rules. So a lot of what he talks about in the foreign informal music piece is the shift from free atonality to 12-tone, that Schoenberg invented a new system to compose with. Right, that's based on the 12 notes of the octave, Western tonality. So free atonality, trying to find new forms of expression by breaking with conventional melody and harmony, was replaced by a more systematic compositional technique, 12-tone. So you have to use all 12 notes before you can use any of them again. So you have to go through the 12 notes before you go back to any of the other 12 notes. So that's serial music, serialism, because of the series of notes. And by the way, it catches on to not only Schoenberg, but others like Stravinsky adopted, so it's very influential. And yet it does seem to be foregoing of the imagination in comparison to the free atonality. So free atonality seems to exhibit more imagination than the systematic technique. All right, so I mentioned sound becoming music, so like sound being self-motivated, self-driving. So there's also the question of tone versus like melody and harmony versus rhythm, and they actually are related to each other. One of the things that defines jazz is syncopation. So there's like a natural emphasis of the beat. So if you play a note, and certainly if you play two notes, if you play a note, or if there's any harmony whatsoever, you play two notes, it suggests a rhythm. Right, so the harmonics already suggest a rhythm. And so the only reason to not go with the natural rhythm suggested by the harmony is, or the sonority, the frequency of vibration of the notes, would be as a kind of counterpoint. Right, so syncopation is when the dominant beat is not emphasized and the subordinate beat is emphasized instead. So instead of 1-2 1-2, it's 1-2 1-2. So it's, again, we've naturalized syncopation. And usually rhythm instruments are white noise instruments, so they do interference, right? So the effect that they have is harmonic interference, which again, you utilize that in order to add dynamics to the music, right? So by not just having a natural sound, but having an intentional tension and counterpoint. That gives it a structure, so at a very basic level. The constructed character of music. It's a paradox. Does it seem like the human imposition of form onto the phenomenon? Or rather, is it the form emerging spontaneously out of the natural phenomenon itself? So, of course, it should be constructed in such a way as seems to arise from the material or seems to be kind of naturally, spontaneously emerging. Right, so that's always the tension. The tension is if something seems forced in art, then it seems unartistic. It seems contrived. It seems like kind of dead. Right, so that's the irony, is that something constructed that you clearly can see as constructed nonetheless seems to have spontaneous life and autonomy. Doesn't seem to be a puppet pulled on strings. Right, so that's the threshold of art. If it looks contrived or forced, then it seems unartistic. And this is true of visual art, it's true of literary art, it's true of music, of performance, performative arts. And then artists play with that threshold. Like, at what point does it seem like it's flowing from the material itself rather than being imposed on it? Even dissonance, so there's consonance and dissonance, so there's the sort of major and minor. Dissonance, even dissonance can have a spontaneous character to it. Can seem like, disharmony can seem like a spontaneous phenomenon of freedom rather than a kind of imposed constraint. Right, so it can, even a dissonant sound can appear to be musical and not just noise. So you can imagine neurologists have studied this, right? So it's been like, what happens in the brain when people hear noise? What happens when they hear music? But the difference from that approach to the kind of approach we've been entertaining in our course is that if you look historically and cross-culturally, what you find is that all sorts of things have been experienced as artistic and musical that might otherwise be considered noise. You were going to say?
I think just in that essay, not the one that, not the most recent, I don't know, but the one before, and he was talking about how people respond better to like a gypsy like music and the best bit. But
the Slav,
yeah,
the Slav melancholy.
So I'm assuming it's that kind of sound that's almost a bit dissonant.
Right, a little bit painful. It's the melancholic. It's the So it's the kind of sound of yearning. It's the sound that sounds like crying rather than singing.
But is that because people respond well to it because it sounds less contrived? It sounds like accidental because, I don't know. Definitely.
Here's another issue with modernism, which is that modernism is also the era of primitivism. So it's in the mid-1800s that Europeans are like, actually non-Western art and culture is more interesting. Right, so a kind of, it comes out of Romanticism, right? That things that are culturally different seem more authentic as art, like seem more authentically aesthetic in character than what Europeans are doing at that point.
Does that have to do with like a crisis of classicism?
Because
Sure.
that sort of fits into like what Hegel would call the category of the symbolic phase of art.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So it's impossible to separate like the cultural aspect from the aesthetic aspect, meaning the attraction to the aesthetic aspect is also the attraction to the cultural aspect. Because it seems like other cultures have that symbolic quality that has been lost with the passing of classicism. Although interestingly, even classicism would have been a challenge to what would have been symbolic prior to that, namely the religious art. Like the medieval art would have been symbolic in that sense. But in hindsight, from the standpoint of Romanticism, classicism itself seems to be symbolic in that way. Right, the kind of identity of like life in aesthetic form or of culture and art, which again in the 19th century, in the modernist era, it seems like those come apart. So life and art, culture and aesthetics seem to diverge from each other, and then people want to repair that. They want to kind of restore that connection.
We're looking at other cultures.
Other cultures seem to have what we lost, right? And, which again is kind of curious because it goes beyond a mere technical attraction, right? Because artists were always attracted at a technical level to things being practiced by other cultures. But this has more of a kind of a substantial kind of pathos to it. It's not just a matter of, oh, they do things a little different and we could adopt those techniques. It's more like that is like a whole art form, whereas we just have some like shadowy simulation of art. So we have some kind of ersatz art. So I'm hoping I'm addressing some of these things that you raised in the notes. Right, so it's, I tried to provide for you guys the musical selection with some kind of exemplary pieces by Cage and Stockhausen. It's hard to like pick like, okay, what can like stand for this artist's work. So I did a kind of mixture of the things that he references with other things that I thought are kind of more, examples. And the names of the pieces are also very like did I do the tone mass? I thought I did the tone mass. Oh, I did not. Alright, we got the piano, the concerto, so we don't have the, I did contact, excuse me, I did the tone mass. That he talks about. Right, so the subjective and the objective. I think we didn't get to that as clearly as I would have liked in our last discussion of the aesthetic theory reading selections in last class. So art is always at this meeting point of the subjective and the objective, meaning if art seems wholly subjective, it appears to be inartistic, or if it appears to be wholly objective, it also seems to be inartistic. So there has to be some kind of commensurability or adequacy between what clearly is subjective intention versus objectively motivated by the material. Right, so that kind of balance or that kind of reconciliation between the it's an old concept, the artist and his materials. So the question is the artist shaping the material, or is the material guiding the artist? Did we talk about the Michelangelo idea? That he's not like giving form to the model, but he's to the marble. He's freeing the form from the marble. Right, kind of classic statement. But one could say that about how any artist works. That they're freeing the form from the material as much as they're giving form to the material. Right, so does the material have a logic of its own? Does it have a kind of reason or of its own? Because that's what rationalization means. The rationalization process. Meaning, is it the conforming of human reason to the reason of the material or the rationality of the material? Or is human reason determinative? Or we could say also, is human activity freeing, like realizing, fulfilling the rationality of the material? And it's the issue that we started the course with, which is the new and the different, Geist, the spiritual content of art. Meaning how to take the given and the same, what exists, and bring forth the new and the different from that. And that's precisely what seems to be in crisis, in a new and different way, in a kind of radical way, in the 20th century. I mean, I should say that Adorno was ambivalent about computer music, electronic music. I think the way he talks about it here is that music has an affinity for mathematics. So, because of harmonics, there's a kind of almost natural science, mathematical character, logical structure to music. But that he says that musicians are the truants from math class, and it would be a shame if they put themselves back into math class. Right, they should stay truants from math class. But that's proven to be difficult. Do any of you have a music background? No.
I play the piano.
That's your classical bourgeois instrument. The piano is the thing. It is the thing. It's classical tonality. It's the instrument of classical tonality. I was never good at piano. It's kind of a shame. I feel like I'm not quite.
It just takes, it's practice.
It is practice.
But,
it is.
I mean,
yeah.
I don't know. I think it's interesting because my parents got my brother and I to do classical music lessons, and I was very good at it, and he was less good. But now, and then he kind of discovered jazz on his own terms, and is now an amazing jazz pianist.
Oh, there you
way
go.
better than me.
All right.
And I've been trying to unlearn my classical training and just be more experimental. But I think it's interesting in light of this discussion. But then I don't know if Adorno would say that jazz is different to classical. I think he would just say that.
So they're not. It's not apples and oranges. No, it's not apples and oranges, because a lot of people trained in the classical tradition felt the attraction of jazz for sure, and conversely, jazz musicians were all classically trained. So, but the that there appears to be a divergence would be attributable to history. In other words, at what moment does it seem like these things go off in their own directions, rather than, being part of the same thing?
I think more is allowed to be qualified as music under jazz, whereas classical music is more rigid.
That's what I mentioned earlier, which is that, so Adorno, by the way, is kind of infamous for his criticism of jazz or his critique of jazz, but what he does with jazz is he does what Marxists always did with their critique, which is critique things that claim to be expressions of freedom. Meaning the things that are most apparently expressions of freedom are the very things that need to be critiqued, precisely for that reason. And so he is attuned to the fact that jazz, the appeal of jazz, is as freedom, and that classical music, by contrast, seems to be unfree. And so he's not saying that it's the reverse or something. He's rather saying the fact that freedom is divided in this way is itself what needs to be understood. And again, that's where capitalism is a self-contradictory form of freedom. And therefore, it should not be surprising that the art of the capitalist era takes on the antinomies of freedom in the way that it does. Right. So jazz is free in one sense. In another sense, it's like rhythmically less, like it's much more metrical. It's just.
But what did Adorno propose that like we do instead of making jazz music?
Informal music,
Okay.
right? So he acknowledges that classical music came to an impasse, and then jazz provided an escape hatch. But he sees jazz as a return to order,
Yeah.
right? And therefore, again, it's not like it's not a genre distinction. Meaning, for Adorno, the same listener, the listener is the same. The classical listener and the jazz listener is the same subject. It's the same listener, which might seem like a stretch, but same listener in the sense of same subject of capitalism. So when he says judgment, aesthetic taste, seems to be more like a kind of accident of exposure, meaning whatever your, life history has exposed you to is going to determine your taste. That wouldn't be taste. Remember that for Kant, if it's just a matter of what you've been instructed in, then that's not taste at all. That's not exercise of judgment at all. That's just cultural conformity. That's just when you like something because you recognize it, because it fulfills your concept of it, rather than your actual feeling in your experience of it. It's a kind of pattern recognition more than it is a actual subjective judgment. It's the difference between culture and art. So culture is easily explained. We like things that are familiar to us, that we're accultured to. But the real question is, why do we like things that we're not already culturally accustomed to? All right. Hopefully that was helpful. Like I said, it's I found this to be a good supplement to the aesthetic theory reading because it's more concrete. So I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.